अस्सलाम वालेकुम दोस्तों, उम्मीद है कि आप सही होंगे। आज का मौजू है हमारा यूक्रेन की नाराज़गी इजराइल के साथ। रशिया की जंग शुरू हुए हुए कोई 1.5 साल होने को आ रहा है और इसके अंदर इजराइल की पोजीशन बड़ी ही इंटरेस्टिंग कह लें या क्रिटिकल कह लें, क्योंकि एक तरफ तो इजराइल के अंदर बहुत रशियन इंटरेस्ट भी मौजूद हैं, मगर एक साइजेबल पॉपुलेशन इजराइल के अंदर यूक्रेन से भी है, उन यहूदियों की जिन्होंने नकल मकानी की थी सोवियत यूनियन से और वो सेटल हुए इजराइल के अंदर। और इस मौजू पे बात करने के लिए वे जॉइंड फ्रॉम टेल अवीव बाय Ksenia Svetlova, who is a former journalist, a former member of the Israeli Knesset, and she joins us from Israel. Thank you so much, Ksenia. Let's get straight to it. Why is Ukraine upset at Israel?
All right. So I would like to, first of all, say a few words about a general tactic of Ukraine or strategy in regards to pressuring some international actors and getting more advanced weapons through this 500 days of this horrific war. So the only tactic basically that Ukraine had, and it elaborated it and basically to the state of perfection, was maximum pressure. Maximum pressure all the time on each country that has weapons that Ukraine needs. And we see that it does the same practically with Germany, specifically with Germany, and with the United States, of course, and also with some other countries, and one of them is Israel. So I would say that the angry reactions in regards to Israeli unwillingness to provide several weaponry that is demanded by the Ukrainian military, it's not targeted specifically only against Israel. This is what Ukraine does. This is a war of existence. They need the weapons, and there is very little leverage on any of the parties. So what they can do is basically say, listen, we can shame you. We'll give you a hard time. We will talk, about your unwillingness to support our just struggle and all of that. And, it's working for them because look at what is happening in the US. Every red line that the Americans said, we will never cross it, we will never do it. And the same with Germany, it was crossed by now.
You are in an interesting position. You were born in Moscow in Soviet Russia. Your family migrated to Israel at the end of the Soviet era or the Soviet Union. Tell us a little bit about your experiences and how that fits into Israel's position, because a lot of Russian citizens ended up in Israel later on, didn't they?
So I can tell you that in the beginning of the 90s, late 80s, beginning of the 90s, a little more than 1 million people immigrated to Israel from the former Soviet Union. But what is interesting about this group, that first of all, they were definitely not Russians. They were Russian speakers, but they came, from republics, various and different from each other, Belarus, Ukraine, Azerbaijan. My husband is from Baku, for example. Me, myself, I'm from Moscow, So if you're looking at those who came directly from Russian territories, they actually might be a minority. I think that the largest group are the Jews that actually came from Ukraine. So after 30 years, being in Israel, I cannot say that everyone has this emotional connection. And you have to keep in mind that also many people had escaped anti-Semitism in the places where they used to live, specifically Ukraine, but also Russia and Belarus and also some other Soviet republics. So I would say that the group that is most perhaps active today in demonstrations, pro-Ukrainian demonstrations and so on, these are the people who came later in the 2000s already, or in the wave of the recent immigration that since after the war had launched already. But you do see a very significant civil society support for Ukraine and Israel, a lot of fundraisings, a lot of private initiatives, and it actually doesn't match at all the unwillingness of the government, not only to supply Ukraine with weapons, but also there is a decrease on the humanitarian aid, for example. And on the other hand, you have this very steady and very ideological, I would say, support for Ukraine by those who not necessarily come from Ukraine itself, but some of them do. There is one of these organizations, it's Israel for Ukraine, Israel supports Ukraine, Israeli Friends for Ukraine, and they're doing some fantastic work.
But on the flip side, there's also a lot of support for Russia in Israel. Tell us about that.
Yeah. So I would say that the support for Russia exists. However, it is rather limited. And how we can tell? Because we saw thousands of individuals, Israelis, who are also native-born Israelis and also immigrants, who protested for Ukraine and who keep doing it on different occasions. On the other hand, when Russian elements, pro-Russian elements, tried to stage some of the protests, pro-Russian protests, they were very minimal in size and very limited in scope. So I cannot say that it doesn't exist, and especially I think among the people who are older and who dependent on the Russian media. For them, it's it's a lifeline. They do not command. They do not have the command of the Hebrew language, and for them, the majority of the information they gather it from Russian governmental channels that, of course, present a very specific worldview that is totally identified with the Russian government and the goals of this war.
What is that worldview? What is that worldview? As a Russian speaker, could you elaborate on what that worldview is that the Russian channels or media espouses?
So basically, I would put it under the category of propaganda. There is ongoing propaganda of the war, an attempt to convince the viewers that the Ukrainians are Nazis, that they collaborated with Nazis, and they are also today they are Nazis. That the West is actually in blame, has the blame of having this war that was it was started by Russia, but they, of course, they blame the NATO, they blame the European Union, they blame Biden, they blame the warmongers in the West, and so on. So if you tune only to these channels, you will be convinced absolutely that Russia is the only just actor, in this game, that it is actually winning the war. And if it's not winning the war, that it happens only because of these intrigues against Russia and the global attempt to weaken it and so on. You would not hear a word about atrocities and violations of human rights and so on. But you will hear a lot of anti-Western propaganda and a lot of anti-Ukrainian bias.
It's a very nuanced subject. You mentioned a lot of history. You mentioned Nazism in there. Vladimir Zelensky's own grandparents survived or were killed in the atrocities that were committed in Ukraine. So tell us about that nuance. Zelensky himself is the second head of state, Jewish head of state in the world. How does that play into all of this?
Well, this is very interesting because I think that Zelensky personally had this idea that perhaps for him being a Jewish, it will also translate into a more substantial support on behalf of the Jewish state. Because there was certainly some excitement when he won the elections and he was elected, and it was like, oh, we have now another Jewish president in the world, like incredible, right? But the political establishment in Israel and military establishment, to a large degree, have a certain worldview on the question of support to Ukraine. So, for example, the most widespread theory is that Israel cannot afford itself support Ukraine military because there is a Russian presence on Israel's border in Syria, and therefore Israel has to be extra careful not to irritate the Russian bear, okay, so to speak. And into this, there is another motive that is, you often hear it, that, that during the war, the Ukrainians participated in all of these atrocities against the Jewish people, which is absolutely true. And there were many documented facts and so on. But I can tell you that, for example, my own family that also suffered in the Holocaust and by large part was exterminated by Nazis. It happened actually in Russia. And the person who read it about them, because some of them were hiding, like Anna Frank, and they were betrayed by a Russian neighbor. It happened not only in Ukraine, unfortunately, it happened in Poland, it happened in Russia, it happened in Belarus, so they were not only the Ukrainians that, shared this blame. And this attempt of Moscow to present things in a certain way. So the Russians only liberated the Jews from the concentration camps. And the Ukrainians only killed the Jews. No, nothing can be further away from the truth, because there were, of course, also Ukrainian soldiers who fought against Hitler. Many of them were recruited. Among them were also Jews, Ukrainian Jews. And there were also, unfortunately, Russian collaborators with the Nazis who ratted on Jews and who gave them away. The picture is more complicated. I think that there is an attempt in Moscow to basically use these historical facts, but of course, changing them and altering them in a way that they will suit the Russian propaganda. When I raised the question in the city of Rostov, it's in southern Russia, and it became famous now due to this rebellion of Yevgeny Prigozhin, of the Wagner Group. So 27,000 Jews were murdered in Rostov. For years, the Russian authorities refused to put a memorial there. Like, why? So this is something that escapes me. But then, of course, you will only, on Russian national channel, you will only listen this one side of the story.
Former Israeli Prime Minister Naftali Bennett recently came out and he said that he convinced the Russian President Vladimir Putin to spare Volodymyr Zelensky. Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, I think that Vladimir Putin had absolutely no plans to spare Vladimir Zelensky, if only he could have like a grip on him, okay? If only his special forces, the Spetsnaz, that landed in Hostomel, the airport near Kyiv, in this fateful night of 24th of February, if they would be able to accomplish their mission, perhaps there would be no President Zelensky today. So, at the stage when Naftali Bennett traveled to Moscow, and it was an unexpected trip, and it took place on Saturday, the holidays for the Jew, for the religious Jews specifically, and so on. So we all thought like, wow, there must be something. But, this theory about like him asking Putin, to like spare the life of his nemesis and so on, I don't know. Like, I think that Russians had a plan, and if they could execute it, they would. The thing is that they were unable to, due to Ukrainian fierce resistance and quick engagement of the West with Ukraine, something that Putin miscalculated on both of them. He thought that his people would be greeted with flowers. Well, they were greeted with also like Kalashnikov and hand grenades and all of that.
The Russian President Putin, the foreign minister, all have come out and hinted, and you were talking about the weight of history and the manipulation of it. They accuse Zelensky of being a Nazi sympathizer. So what is the tactic there? Why this disinformation, and is it effective?
Well, I think that for some parts of the Russian audience, the captive audience at home, it might be effective because, they're being brainwashed now for at least 9 years since the invasion to Crimea. For example, again, interestingly, about Crimea, as a child in Soviet Union, I visited Crimea with my family. And we brought from there this booklet of the old Crimean tales. And all of these tales actually had, like Muslim names, Tatar names, or Turks names, and so on, because there is, of course, long Turkish and Tatar history in this part of land. But now, according to this new Russian ideology, Crimea was always Russian, and it's only Russian. There is no place to anybody else there, and it's like amazing, like how you can convince people who, again, must have these same recollections, just like me. Like I remember the tales about Khan Girey, and the names of the historical places in Crimea, like all of them, Turkish words, Turk words. Right now, you can, if you're like working in an organized way, you can brainwash anybody to anything. This is very effective propaganda. So you can convince people that Zelensky, a Jew, who also nominated, he had at some point a prime minister, I think was a Jew, and a few of members of parliament and some other ministers. So he is a Nazi sympathizer. You can convince some people. It's not working in the West. It's not working in Israel. But I can tell you that Israelis are being bombarded in social networks by these cyber campaigns that Russia is waging in order to make people think that, things are not that, like simple. And maybe there is some truth, in this allegations, sympathizing with the Nazis and so on. Well, I can tell you that in Russia itself, a lot of the organizations that are identified as a far right, they use swastikas, Sieg Heil, they sympathize with Hitler, with Nazis. And you know that one of the people who had this kind of Nazi sympathies was actually the person who established Wagner Group, and the name Wagner, the Richard Wagner, the German composer, that, of course, believed in this racial theory and was an anti-Semite, was a preferred composer with the Nazis. It was not chosen for just, because they liked his music. There was a reason why it happened, So then again, anybody who has an access to open media, to this marketplace of opinions, will, of course, compare the data, make his own, idea, wrap up his mind about this. A person who only derives all of his knowledge from that, there is no chance to beat it. They work consistently and they engage many tactics in this regard. And I think that, yes, unfortunately, I'm speaking to some of the older, not relatives, but like friends of my family and so on in Moscow, and I'm appalled. It's unbelievable how easy it is to work on intelligent people who are educated and went to university, and you can just tell them that, Ukrainians are crucifying Russian kids, in their cities, and people believe it. Like it's
how so? Like, tell us a little bit about that. Like, what kind of disinformation are they accepting as fact?
So, this anti-Ukrainian propaganda, it didn't start yesterday. It took 9 years almost since the invasion to Crimea in 2014 to prepare the ground. And then, fake news were injected into the system with the whole purpose of destabilizing a person. Horrible news, like the story that was broadcasted by the Russian Channel 1 about a boy, 3 or 5 years old, who was crucified in eastern Ukraine by Ukrainian ultra-nationalists and Nazi sympathizers and so on. What can be more horrible than to hear about the story with all of the bloody details, how his mother cried and how he was agonizing, also allegations like a Jesus Christ, and so on. And then, of course, when, independent media made a research about this lady that testified in this report by the Channel 1, it was still back then in 2014. They found out that it's not a true story, that she is actually not just an ordinary citizen, but a wife of an FSB official. The whole story was fabricated. There was, mix-up also with dates, with names, with every single detail in the story. Nothing of it was true, nothing. But, when you broadcast something as dramatic on your state TV. That is also one of the most viewed channels in Russia. There are, some state channels that are not interesting in some countries and people don't tune to them. Not in Russia. In Russia, this channel 1, it's very major, it's very dominating. And then perhaps, some of the audience never heard what happened next. So they never heard of these investigations because they happened on the independent media that were eliminated, slowly, one by one. And for them, even if they thought like, okay, maybe there is some exaggeration there, maybe it didn't happen exactly, but they will still remember that the Ukrainians are the bad guys. So there is no smoke without a fire and all of that, conspiracy theories. And then it's not the only story, and there are also other stories. And it's like one by one, you have this whole programming basically oriented on two things: inflict this horrible hatred of Ukrainians, and also make the little person, the ordinary person, feel that he is not safe, that there are big powers that are conspiring against Russia in NATO, in Washington, in Brussels, and all of that. There is also like attempt to make them think that they want to change the Russian culture, traditional Russian culture. I don't know what it is, because there was 75 years, there was the Soviet Union. And since then, for 30 years, I don't know, I don't feel that the current Russian regime is particularly religious or that it ensembles some traditional religious, like Orthodox values and so on. Any more than any other secular leader in any other country. But, they like to talk a lot about like the West, they disseminate this LGBT and they want us to break up our families. Putin speaks about it. Okay, so we have to defend not only our country, our physical borders, we have to defend our values because we have different values. We are not part of them. And pay attention, Ali, the same very person, Putin, used to talk very differently in the beginning of the 2000s. He used to say that Russia is an organic part of Europe, that you cannot imagine Europe without Russia, and the values are in tune. Okay, so now when he needs to say something else, well, he have all of the means to make people to believe in what he says and support it.
You mentioned culture wars and you mentioned values. Interestingly, some of the most vociferous defense of the Russian position comes from settlers in Israel who originate or are Russian speaking. How does that dynamic play into all of this?
I don't know if it's, the settlers specifically or just the right-wingers. Many of the right-wingers, indeed, they support Putin. And I think there was this cult of admiration of not Putin as a person who obviously did a lot of wrong things in his career, but Putin as a symbol of strength, of might. Okay, so I remember very well during one of the military operations of Israel in Gaza, I was taking a cab and the cab driver recognized the Russian name in me. And he told me, listen, I wish we could have somebody like Putin come to Israel and like making things right in a couple of weeks. Let Putin come and like make, things orderly, like he did in Chechnya. And okay, serenity now, what do I answer him? And I told him, listen, first of all, people like Putin, if they come to your land, they do not leave, not in a couple of weeks, and maybe not ever, okay? Because this is about basically power. It cannot be just applied in one sense. It will apply against everybody. Citizens of a foreign country, your own citizens, of course, will pay the price. And in the end of the day, people who admire power also become victims of this power, okay? But nevertheless, there is this kind of image in Israel, and I think that also perhaps in the far right wings in US, that while the West needs to be always very careful about things we say and things we do and so on, Putin doesn't have any accountability. He can do whatever, okay? So for many right-wingers who never stepped their foot in Gaza, I used to work there as a journalist. I know how this place looks like, okay? It's miserable. people there are miserable, and they are, they need to get their rights and so on. There are, of course, some organizations that are, of course, exploiting this and engaging with terror, but nevertheless, there is a very miserable place. So they look at it and they say, okay, we just want to wipe Gaza out, like Putin did in Chechnya, without understanding that what Putin did in Chechnya is paying ransom to the guy who is now the leader of Chechnya, Ramzan Kadyrov, and he is being paid ransom by the Russian Federation. The laws of Russian Federation, its constitution, do not apply in Chechnya. It's an ex-territory in the sense. Okay, so I think that, again, for people who would want, in a very undemocratic way, of course, to solve all of Israel's problem, not through diplomacy and through difficult negotiations, peace negotiations with the Palestinians and so on, for those who just want to use the power to solve the problems.
It's very interesting you mentioned this. It's very interesting you mentioned this because right now Israel is going through a lot of tumult internally in the occupied territories. We saw the military offensive in Jenin. Some say there's a judicial coup underway with Itamar Ben-Gvir as the head of the security services and so on and so forth. What is that domestic situation and how does that feed into this whole Ukraine argument of Russia-Ukraine war?
So democracy is at stake in Israel. It's being jeopardized. I personally believe that democracy, it's not something that is just given to you. Even if you were born into a democratic society, you really have to fight for it every single day, because there will always be people who would want to exploit it, who would want to run you over, and to become the exclusive rulers without an opportunity to change them at some point and so on, So this is what is happening in Hungary, more or less. So for us in Israel, those of us who believe in democracy, these are very difficult times. People do engage in demonstrations. Every Saturday night, there are hundreds of thousands of people, up to 500,000, who participate in these demos around the country, by the way. And again, if you are breaking down the position on Ukraine, so you would see that among the so-called democratic camp, you would find more supporters of Ukraine that understand that a global power like Russia that invaded the country, other country, because it wants to secure its domination in it, and so on, under false pretext and so on, bombing and pounding its citizens. This is not right. This is not right. And you would also find the correlation also to the people who support the two-state solution and in general, diplomatic solution, negotiated solution for Israel and Palestine. And you would find, this is again very coarse, division, but just to point out who is where. And the other camp, specifically, not only the right-wingers. I know many right-wingers who disagree with the current government and also are very supportive of Ukraine and so on. I think that they have kind of inside dilemma because they support Ukrainian right for self-determination, but not Palestinian, for example. For me, it's something very weird. I think that you have been consistent, with things that you believe in.
Thank you, Ksenia Svetlova, for joining us from Israel. तो ये थी Ksenia Svetlova, former Israeli sahafi और member of the Israeli Knesset, जो हमें बता रही थी कि कितना एक complex और nuanced situation है इजराइल के अंदर ये यूक्रेनियन जंग को लेकर, और किस तरीके से रशियन डिसइंफॉर्मेशन और वो लोग जो रशिया से या सोवियत यूनियन से या उन एरियाज में जहां पे सोवियत यूनियन फैली हुई थी वहां से नकल मकानी करके इजराइल पहुंचे और अभी तक उनके जो ताल्लुकात हैं मीडिया से या अपनी इंफॉर्मेशन वो ज्यादातर रशियन चैनल से लेते हैं, वो इस चीज में यकीन रखते हैं कि जी रशिया सही है और यूक्रेन गलत है। और व्लादिमीर ज़ेलेंस्की स्पेसिफिकली जो एक यहूदी सदर हैं यूक्रेन के, दुनिया के दूसरे यहूदी सदर आप कह लें इजरायली सदर हेrzog के बाद, उनका क्या किरदार है इन सब चीज़ों के अंदर। मगर एट द एंड ऑफ द डे कसेनिया का ये कहना है कि इसके अंदर पुतिन साहब की और रशियन डिसइंफॉर्मेशन का बहुत बड़ा किरदार है, ये दरारें क्रिएट करने में बिटवीन इजराइल और यूक्रेन। تو یہ تھا ہمارا آج کا پروگرام. اپنے کامنٹس سجیشنز میں بھیجتے رہیں اور ضرور